Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. It's the final round of the Olympiad in Chennai. Two teams shared the lead, Uzbekistan and Armenia, both with 17 points. There were three teams just behind them on 16. India 2 and the USA. So Uzbekistan and Armenia knew if they slipped up, then one of those teams could leapfrog over them into the lead. So it could not be closer. Very tense. Now, the first game that had real significance was on board 1 in the Armenia against Spain match. So Gabriel Sargsyan for Armenia had a fantastic tournament. And he was playing Alexei Shirov. Now, it's already quite an unbalanced position. We know that Shirov likes positions that are dynamically interesting. So the pawn structure of white has been a little compromised here. Both sides have castled queenside. White has the two bishops. Sargsyan has just played the queen back to d2, threatening, of course, bishop g5 with a double attack. And here you could say, well, the normal move is bishop e7 to cover that. I mean, maybe Shirov was a little bit concerned about queen a5. I mean, it's very hard to say. But Shirov thought for 17.5 minutes here and played g6. Well, that's unusual. So what's the idea? Well, Sargsyan played bishop g5, hitting the queen. Queen h5. Now, probably Shirov had anticipated bishop takes rook. Then comes bishop h6. Watch out. f4 stops that. Rook takes d8. So it's an exchange sacrifice. And actually, black will win the pawn on f4. And with control over the dark squares, black has pretty decent compensation there. Very creative from Shirov. The problem is in this position, Sargsyan did not take on d8. Instead, he just played bishop e2, and that queen is in big trouble. Watch what happens if the rook moves. h4 shuts the queen in, followed by f4, winning the queen. So this was a disaster for Shirov. He tried to complicate with bishop b4. If that's taken, then queen takes bishop. But queen e3 just maintains the protection of the bishop. e5, Sargsyan took the rook. And now he's just a clear exchange ahead. And f4. White is the exchange up, has complete control in the position. So that already looked desperate for Spain, but very promising for Armenia. Looks like, you know, they were going to score on their first board, and that put the pressure on Uzbekistan. Now let's switch to that match. So Uzbekistan were playing a strong team from the Netherlands. So let's go to board 2. So Jon van Foreest against Nodibek Yakubayev. Well, you know, we know this, the Uzbek team full of, you know, these really young players. Yakubayev, well, let's just check. Yeah, he is 20 years old, just 20. Against Jon van Foreest, well, he's also pretty young, but certainly more experienced. Now, after 18 moves, van Foreest has pressure on that pawn on e6. Could defend passively, but instead Yakubayev decided to sack the exchange. And I think this is much better than defending passively. the computer likes this for white, but in human terms this is very difficult to consolidate this extra exchange, because these minor pieces look quite threatening and white's pawn structure has really been compromised. The computer shows a very delicate line for white that perhaps gives the advantage, involving f4 and then sacking this pawn and then bringing this knight back. Well, this is so involved. To be honest, it's all about destabilizing black's pawn structure. You want to upset black with f5, undermining the support here, and also trying to embarrass that knight as well, because if black solidifies with c6, then you can see that knight is very poorly placed, hasn't got an escape square here, and then bishop d2 looks pretty nasty. But those are really delicate steps, very hard to see, and after a long think, Van Foreest thought for 25 minutes. He played b3 and actually decided to simplify the position. This can easily turn against white. If you get one thing wrong, another pawn goes and suddenly black just looks better. So Van Foreest decided to play pragmatically. He gave back the exchange. Remember, if rook takes, then bishop takes knight. But basically the game just petered out to a draw. And let's just go through the final few moves. And here they repeated the position. Yeah, it's equal. So a draw in that game. Now so that was a fairly short draw after 33 moves. Let's go to board 1. Remember, Uzbekistan really needed to score in this match. A 2-all draw wouldn't do, considering that Armenia were looking good, not just with that board 1 game, but the other games look comfortable as well. So this is Abdusattorov, a 17-year-old star, the world rapid champion 2021, playing against Anish Giri. Well, that is a tough one, but very unbalanced position. But once again, Abdusattorov showed such resolve. a4, g3 looks quite frightening, but Abdusattorov defended well. Rook f1, rook e3 hits the knight. Now if that knight moves, there could be problems with the advance of that f-pawn, but king d2 held things firm and also hits the rook. Has to move. The king came back. Rook takes pawn check, threatened. So the rook came back to defend, and the position repeated. A draw. Sterling defense from Abdusattorov. He kept the game very tense all the way through. Tricky position, but he held it. So 2 draws. Okay, let's move on to the board 3 game. Sindarov against Bok. Again, another very tense game where Sindarov with white had won the exchange, and he's got these 2 active rooks tying black down to the defense of that g-pawn. However, Bok from the Netherlands has 2 pawns and a knight for the rook, and a very solid position. Everything is protected. I think black's dilemma here is, do you sit and wait, or do you try and advance your pawns? If these pawns advance, then that rather destabilizes black's position, because the knight needs protection, which protects that, and the knight protects the pawn. The rook is tied down here. What do? Do you sit and wait? If you sit and wait, then the king might emerge and slowly the pawns could advance. Difficult to know. Bok decided to advance. And again, king g3 is an interesting move if White wants to play for a win, but Sindarov took no chances. He put the rook behind the pawn, and when the pawn advanced to d5, rook e5 hits the pawn on d5, and now the position liquidates. Here, neither side should risk anything. Rook b3 check, and Sindarov decided, I think very understandably, just to come back with the king, and both players happy with the draw here. Why did Sindarov just keep it solid with white? Why didn't he maybe push it earlier with king g3? Well, he saw that on board 4 his colleague Jahongir Vahidov actually had a very promising position. So let's look at this board 4 game. If they could win this one, Uzbekistan would win the match, and actually they had a better tiebreak than Armenia, who still looked very promising. So let's look at this one. Max Varmadam playing for the Netherlands against Jahongir Vahidov from Uzbekistan. So Varmadam is known for his opening surprises, not just in his own games, but he has helped Van Foreest prepare, for example, in some key games. And he plays the Rossolimo with white, which is a very respectable opening. At the moment I'm working on an anti-Sicilians course for black, and I'm not actually recommending this main line for black, but this main line is very playable. Knight f6. Recently white has been doing very well with the old move rook e1. But Varmadam sprung his first surprise, d4. Now this is a pawn sacrifice that I used to play as a teenager, and it's a lot of fun for white. If you want to surprise your opponent, this is not a bad idea. You can play knight takes e4 here, but actually after d5, white gets pretty good compensation by hitting this knight and putting pressure here. Vahidov played the approved move after 15 minutes thought. He was obviously a little surprised by this. And now white can continue in gambit vein like this. And again, it's quite a tricky position. Instead of moving the knight back from c6, in fact the best move is knight d6. White has compensation, it's interesting, but that's the best for black. But instead of continuing in gambit mode, Varmadam pushed with e5, and this leads to steadier positions. Knight c7 is the approved move. You would very much like white to take here, and that gives black control over some light squares. But knight c3, and one can take the bishop on b5, but a6 is reasonable. Castles. At first glance, this looks impressive for white with these pawns, these nice central pawns, but actually after d6, this breaks down white's centre very quickly, and black is actually fine in this position. There's pressure here. This bishop can often come out to g4 very quickly to put pressure on the knight and on the centre, and this bishop on g7 looks fine. d5, knight a5, good move. And if the bishop retreats, well, yeah, you've got to watch that pawn basically. So queen a4, Varmadam playing creatively to try and hold things. I think he would like it if black gave up that bishop to take the pawn. Then white would have compensation. But Vahidov plays very responsibly. Rook e8 guards that pawn. and bishop f5. Remember, that's kind of the extra bishop. The light square bishop has no opponent, and that's problematic for white. And now b4. So this is about undermining white's support for the pawn on d5, but also, you know, you want to get to that pawn on b2 as well. So basically black's activity carries him through here. Bishop takes, queen takes, and bishop takes b2. And black can get away with this brazen pawn capture. Why not? Bit of pressure here, but no problem. Bishop c3, that's a nice move to make when it's anchored by the pawn on b4. And if bishop takes pawn, you can just take this because there's a pin. So after bishop c3, rook e3, f6. Black has a clean and clear extra pawn. Queen h4. Warmerdam still trying to, you know, find some compensation in this position. If that's taken, then knight takes, and be careful. But Vakhidov, now this position you need to calculate, and he takes the pawn on d5. Ice cold. Nerves. Looks risky, you know, self-pinning like this, taking this pawn, but he's calculated it all out. e6, you can hold this. And Warmerdam took on f6, but actually everything is okay for black in this position. It's just a simplification. After queen takes, well, if knight takes, rook takes, white's only a pawn down, has some activity, but here, well, after queen takes pawn, check, then you take the queen, and now black is 2 pawns up. So this endgame already gave the rest of the team from Uzbekistan hope. They realized that, you know, they could play solidly because it seemed that black is 2 pawns up, and if this is converted, then Uzbekistan would win the match, basically. But could Vakhidov convert this position? Yes, 2 extra pawns, but white is very active. And got to watch out for that 7th rank as well. Black's king could be a bit better here. So it's a tricky position. Rooks and knights are always very tricky. Let's get to the crunch moment in the game. Rook d6, a5. Well, I'm sure that Vakhidov was happy to see those pawns just marching down the board. It's actually 3 extra pawns in this position, but well, it's difficult to hold on to everything here, and that's a very sensible move, just trying to chop pieces off the board. And if the rook avoids that, then check, and actually white's king could be in trouble. So rook takes rook, rook takes, and again that rook d3 check is very annoying for white. If the king goes back, well, watch what happens. That was quick. Mate on the back rank, next move. G3, knight h5, hitting that one. King h4, knight g7. So it's still quite tricky. But Vakhidov has managed to calculate well. And he's, if necessary, going to bring the rook back to block on the 7th rank. So he has control here. These are the 2 extra pawns on the king side that should bring the point home, but it is very tricky. And now all the pressure was on him. He knew if he could win this game, it could mean victory for the team. Well, it would mean victory for the team. and their tiebreak was better than Armenia. By this stage it was clear that Armenia were going to win their match against Spain. So could he bring this one home? Knight comes in, so that means, of course, rook takes pawn, knight d5 check. King comes back. Rook e4, that's a nice move to make because it protects the pawn but also controls the king as well. King comes up, check. This is a slight problem. Yes, the rook is good, the knight looks good, but the king doesn't have shelter. And Vakhidov goes backwards. Now that's a bit uncomfortable with the king trapped on the 7th rank. But it's difficult for white to exploit that because hard to get the king and the knight into play. But Warmadam tries, floating around with the knight, trying to find a way in, and finally he gets the knight to e4, so this is tricky. Imagine the pressure on Vakhidov in this position. He knows he should be winning, but to finish it off is not easy. g5, finally one of the pawns advances. Knight c5. Trying to get in. g4 check. Yes, the pawn advances, getting closer. That rook in a superb position. And the knight not doing badly as well. Rook c4 pushes the knight to a worse square. Rook c3 check. Right, here we go. So now it's crunch time for the king. If it moves forward, the pawn goes forward. g2. Knight g7 check. So the pawn is just one square from queening. Now it gets a little bit tricky. Black has quite a choice here. You can just take that knight and play rook c2. Protecting the pawn, hitting this one, should be winning. But instead, Vakhidov wants to just get a queen straight away. And actually this is winning. So if knight takes, you can just get a queen. There's no problem there. Rook b8 check. And now king d7 is the best move. That was played. And here Warmadam resigned. If rook check, then king c6 threatens the rook. Threatens to get a new queen. That really is too much. And by this stage it was absolutely clear. The match was over. Uzbekistan won by 2.5, 1.5. Armenia had also won their match. However, Uzbekistan's tiebreak was better and Uzbekistan won the gold. An extraordinary performance. So just to wrap up, Uzbekistan finished with 19 points. Armenia also finished with 19 points. They took the gold, Uzbekistan the gold, Armenia the silver. And in bronze medal position, India too, who did very well to defeat a strong German team. So bronze medal to India too. Then 3 teams further down, India, USA, Moldova on 17 points. They defeated the English team. Very good result for Moldova in the last round. But Uzbekistan, let's just focus on them. What a fantastic performance. On top board, the 17-year-old Nodirbek Abdusattorov, a star already, world rapid play champion, he scored 8.5 out of 11 on top board. Fantastic performance. On second board, Nodirbek Yakubayev, apologies if I butchered his pronunciation, he's just 20 years old. And he scored 8 out of 11. On the third board, Javohir Sindarov. Now, Sindarov is just 16 years old. He scored 6.5 out of 10. Then we had Jahongir Vakhidov. He's the old man, 27 years old. He scored 6.5 out of 8 on board 4, and the reserve board, board 5, Shamsidin Vokhidov. Now he's just 20 years old. He scored 3.5 out of 4. So collectively, they really put in a shift. There really wasn't a weak performance in that team. And the other reason why I think this is a really deserved gold medal, you could say, well, they won on tiebreak, but actually in the individual match between Uzbekistan and Armenia, Uzbekistan won convincingly by 3-1. So totally deserved. And I think this, well, Armenia has a team of oldies, relatively old players, but what an incredible performance. And this does represent, you know, you could say a changing of the guard at the top. These players from Uzbekistan that show incredible promise, and now they're fulfilling that promise with this absolutely superb performance. So congratulations to them. Now, I've hardly had time to, well, I haven't had time to dip into the women's Olympiad, but I will do in some recordings later. But just to mention that I'm delighted that the Ukrainian women's team won the gold medal. It was incredibly tight. India looked so good, but they failed at the last. But a really tight last round. Ukraine and Georgia actually were level on 18 points, but Ukraine won it on tiebreak, and I'm absolutely delighted for them. There we go, folks. As ever, I love the Olympiad. It's a wonderful competition. There's so much going on, and by all accounts, Chennai did a fantastic job in staging the tournament. So I hope you've enjoyed my coverage. Thanks very much for watching.